Hey guys, and welcome to the semifinal edition of the Fantasy Points XFL Breakdown. It's playoff time. I'm your host, Jake Tribbey, and I've got Chris Wecht here by my side to help us break down every angle of the Divisional Championship XFL slate. Chris, how are you doing today, and how did your Week 10 go?
I'm doing good. Coming off round one of the NFL draft where my Eagles lapping the fields with the rest of the league and ready to crush some XFL.
Yeah, the Eagles now have the entire Georgia defensive front from 2021, which was like the greatest college defense ever. So that's definitely pretty exciting. Um, my week 10, for what it's worth, was a roller coaster because I absolutely ate it
Mm.
on main slate. I was underweight McCarron, and I played a ton of Aline, who obviously zeroed. And then I won the Houston Showdown slate, which was my first Showdown bank ever. So that saved me, um, and
Yeah,
some nice momentum to carry into the playoffs here, I think.
the my week 10 didn't go great either. I think that was by far the hardest slate of the season to play because we knew we
Yeah.
had two teams that could have played starters, could have played backups, so you really couldn't do a lot there. You had And then you had two other teams that we knew were going to try to score as many points as possible, leading them to be chalk. So it becomes a game of like how much chalk can you eat, because you probably have to eat some because of how much they're going to score. And that's basically what played out. I mean, McCarron was what, 35-40% owned and
Yep.
dropped 50 points. It's going to be tough to win a GPP on those weeks unless you just what you probably needed, like Jameel from
Yeah.
Orlando and
Yeah. I
some
was
other
pretty
very
surprised at
random
how
plays. Yeah.
yeah, I was a little surprised at how popular Jameel ended up being. Like the
Mhm.
the number of people who I saw after the St. Louis game who had the McCarron Butler with the Jameel run back, like my
Yeah.
mind was absolutely
I
blown.
know.
I
I was
was
like,
like,
how did
oh
he
yeah.
land on that?
Yeah, I'm totally cooked. And especially with how McCarron and Butler combined for 100 points. So with that, what can you do? But still plenty of money making opportunities ahead of the playoffs. First game this week, we got the Arlington Renegades at the Houston Roughnecks. This is a Saturday 7 p.m. kickoff, prime time game on Saturday. Total here is 41 and a half. Houston's favored by 6.5. I have seen a little more juice on the Houston side. I wouldn't be surprised if they got out to 7 here shortly. Chris, before we get into injuries, any bets you like on this one?
I like the under, I think Houston's playing a little bit of a new game, relying on their defense a little bit more, not necessarily trying to outscore teams by scoring the most points. And Arlington is still very up and down despite the boost in offensive production from Perez. They still could easily go out and score very little points.
Yeah, it's tough. I do think this total probably comes down another half point or so, which probably makes the under a decent bet. I can't I can't back the Houston side. I mean, I think
No.
I'd probably prefer Arlington on the spread. I don't think I'm going to take a side on the total, but I'm with you. I'd lean under. I do think Arlington's a bit of a value here. I mean, we've said time and time again, the sports books are really slow to adjust to quarterback changes, and I still think Arlington's being priced as if Luis Perez isn't their starter, and they just slightly improved in the second half of the season. True line here is probably closer to 4, maybe 5, I think. So yeah, probably some value on the Arlington side. Getting into injuries, really not too much to worry about here. It's actually a pretty clean slate overall in terms of injuries. Victor Bolden's out. That's, to be expected. He's missed 4 or 5 weeks in a row. Letty Brown missed a few practices early in the week. I believe logged a limited practice on Thursday, but he's listed probable with a knee injury. Bob Stoops said in an interview this week that they expect Letty Brown to play. So I wouldn't worry about anything there. On the Houston side, there is one big piece of news to keep track of. Wide receiver Michael Bandy is listed as questionable. He's been dealing with this hip injury for a number of weeks. He did log some limited practices thus far. So absolutely a guy to keep an eye on there. We can talk about sort of the implications of him potentially playing in a minute, but starting with the Arlington side, it's pretty easy to sort these quarterbacks into tiers this week. I mean, obviously, Danucci's quarterback one, top value of the week, highest projected quarterback. And then you've got Teamu sort of in that middle tier. And then you've got guys like Silvers and obviously Luis Perez here for Arlington, who, probably won't be more, at least on the 2 game slate, than like 10 or 15% owned. At the same time, though, like these guys just don't have anywhere near the fantasy juice that the quarterbacks in the Sunday game do. So Chris, what do you want to do with Luis Perez here? And then we can get into the conversation of how are we going to play Arlington wide receiver roulette.
Yeah, I don't think I'm going to play much Perez. He doesn't project super well. He's not like as cheap as we've seen other low tier quarterbacks be throughout the season. If you can find an extra 1,000, you can get to Teamu, who I like a good bit better. I don't think I'm going to play much Perez. I do think there is some value with if you can figure out which of his pass catchers is a good play. I think one of them will be. It's just figuring out which one. My lean is for Tyler Vaughn's right now. He gets 17-ish% of the targets every week. He's running a good amount of the routes, but like nobody on their team really runs all of the routes other than Canella is probably the closest. Everybody else is always in a 40 to 50% range. They're all cheap though, so they don't have to do a lot. You're not going to need. This is probably not a week where you need, you're a 3K guy to score 10 plus points, 15 plus points, or anything like that. So I think there is some value in trying to take some shots on some of these guys. It's just tough to figure out which ones.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I'm going to play a little bit of Perez, pretty much only based around the ownership angle there. I mean, Perez or Silvers, you're really just banking on the Sunday game being, going under the total in both of these. If Teamu or Danucci gets to 30, you're pretty much totally cooked if you play Silvers or Perez. So I'll have a little bit of exposure there. Probably match the field at around 10%. Nothing crazy. And I'm with you. I think Tyler Vaughn's is the guy that I want to target. We're about 20% higher on Vaughn's than the industry, and I think that's right. To me, from watching the games, I think he's pretty clearly their wide receiver one. But it's so tough when nobody outside of Sal Cannella runs more than like 50% of the routes.
Mm-hmm.
That said, I mean, we could definitely see route shares concentrate a little bit more this week because it's the playoffs. So I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Vaughn's push for a 70, maybe 80% route share. Beyond him, I also wrote up Javonte Payton.
Yeah.
At 3,000, I think he's definitely got some juice, right around 50% of the routes. The targets aren't really there. I don't think he's had more than 3 targets in a game this season, but he's 3,000. Like he gets you 7 points on a 2-game slate. That's probably enough.
Yeah, and his route share has been on the rise too, so maybe that's a sign of something. So
yeah, beyond him, I mean, Rennell Hall projects okay for us. It's really, really thin after that.
Lujuan Winningham has gotten a decent amount of red zone, end zone looks.
Yeah.
Maybe you could catch a touchdown with him.
Yeah, he gets some deep looks as well. I'm probably more privy to him on the 2-game slate. He's priced up a little bit in Showdown, 3,800, where like a guy like Peyton's the minimum price. Realistically, I think especially for Showdown, you can pretty much justify any of these Arlington wide receivers. And, if I'm making 10 plus lineups, like I'm probably going to have exposure to 4 or 5 Arlington wide receivers across those lineups because it feels like such a crapshoot. But Tyler Vaughn's is absolutely my favorite. Do any of these like more ancillary guys? I mean, Arcanato, Van Der Esch, any of them stand out to you, or you got to stick with sort of those top 2 or 3?
I'd throw Arcanato in that same bucket with Peyton, and probably, I mean, he's been around one of the longer. We've seen times where he's gotten a lot of work. You just got to get lucky that you catch the right week.
Yeah, I mean, it's so tough. We have pretty much all these guys after Vaughn's projected for between 3.5 and 5.5 DraftKings points. Yeah. So, like I said, I mean, you can justify just about all of them in Showdown. For the 2-game slate, I'll probably just be sticking to Vaughn's, maybe some Peyton, but I probably won't be going too crazy there. The backfield here, I think, is pretty interesting. Davion Smith, my take was that I think he goes a little over-owned in the Showdown slate because the Showdown slate is kind of light on guys who project for more than 10 DraftKings points. So I think he'll be really popular on Showdown. 2-game slate, though, I think everyone's just going to drift towards Abram Smith. I mean, why play Davion Smith or Max Borghi when for what, like 1,500 more, you can get a running back who's going to play every single snap for DC. And I mean, you can argue Davion Smith both ways. If the Arlington offense comes out flat, I mean, he's totally dust because he's entirely touchdown dependent.
Right.
My thing is though, like if he's going to be 20% owned, I'm I'm a little tempted, honestly. I mean, the touchdown equity is pretty good. He scored at least 11 and a half DraftKings points in I think his last 5 games. He's also averaged 15 and a half over that stretch, which matches Abram Smith for the season long lead. There's definitely some juice here, but Arlington needs to find the end zone.
Yeah.
So yeah, how do you want to play Davion Smith this week? And also any thoughts on backfield teammate Letty Brown?
I think I'm gonna fade Letty Brown. He's gonna definitely be more popular, good bit more popular because he's how cheap he is, and I think I'll have some Devion Smith, as we'll get to with the Houston side. I think I really want to take shots on this Houston backfield, which I don't love the idea of having a Houston back and an Arlington back. And like I said, I think there's some value in taking shots on some of these receivers. I don't want to go too crazy with this game, particularly on the Arlington side. So I'm definitely not going to get crazy with it, but I do think Devion Smith has some good leverage opportunity. I mean, we've seen Houston come out flat on both offense and defense at times, and you just need him to fall into the end zone. He's not crazy expensive like he used to be. So yeah, I think Smith's a little interesting.
Yeah, certainly not my favorite running back, but at least for a little bit of leverage on the 2 game slate, I think you could do a lot worse. Letty Brown, I mean, yeah, I pretty much wrote him up exactly what you said. I think I like Showdown. I mean, he's fine. I don't really have a strong take there. His price is fine. I'll play a decent bit. 2 game slate though. I mean, I like as things stand right now, I like both TJ Hammonds and Bryson Aline more than I like Letty Brown as salary relief. And I mean, prices got a little condensed this week. So I was thinking about it. I was playing around with some builds. I think like Danucci, Abram Smith, and then like one of the expensive Seattle guys, Josh Gordon, Blake Jackson, Ja'Cory Pearson will be like the most common sort of base build that people start with. And then obviously you need a little salary relief there. Seems like Letty Brown's going to be some of the most popular salary relief on the slate. I mean, his floor is solid. He's getting, 40% of the snaps in one of the more valuable backfields in the XFL. His problem though is that like he has no ceiling in the healthy games he's played with, or the games he's played with a healthy Davion Smith.
Yeah.
I think like 3 total games there hasn't exceeded, double digit DraftKings points in any of those games. He's averaging 2 red zone touches per game with a healthy Davion Smith, which is like pretty respectable. That's 4th among playoff running backs, but he has 0 inside the 5 touches and just 1 inside the 10 touch. In those games with a healthy Davion Smith. Like the goal line roll just isn't going to be there. You need him to score a touchdown from like probably 15 plus yards out to really like get there for you. I don't think I full fade him on the 2 game slate, but if he's going to be like 35% owned, I'm probably going to be way underweight. I might only play 15%, something around there. Yeah, Chris, any thoughts on this Arlington backfield before we move on?
I think you covered it. Yeah, take a shot on one of the Arlington receivers. They might give you a 0, but they also might give you 15, which I don't know if Letty Brown can even get you 15. So
Oh yeah, I mean like Tyler Vaughn's versus Letty Brown. Like I'd much prefer
right.
Vaughn's. Like yeah, I really don't have much hope for Letty having much of a ceiling. I mean, in like single entry, smaller field stuff on the 2 game
Yeah,
slate,
then sure.
he's fine. I mean, he projects well for us. He projects well industry wide. Like the floor's really good. Especially among like sub 5K guys, he might have the best floor. Yeah, there was another guy that I actually wanted to mention. This is our first kicker talk since we've started the show. But for the showdown slate, I actually like Taylor Russolino as a play. He's the minimum price. And, you look at the min price range for the Arlington showdown slate, it's like Javonta Payton and then Michael Bandy, I think is 1,200. And then it's like everyone else is like pretty much completely dust. Russolino is tied for the league lead in field goal attempts. He's missed just once from inside of 40 yards, and he's 2 for 3 from 50 or more yards. Last week, I mean, we saw, the Arlington offense move the ball a little bit, but often got shut down, especially once they got on Houston's side of the field. Russolino scored 11 DraftKings points. At the minimum price, that's pretty dang good. I think he's got, a pretty solid floor here. And yeah, I'd consider him a pretty solid play overall for the showdown slate. Obviously, we don't do kicker projections, but I think if we did, he would probably be the highest projected minimum price player by a solid point or two on the slate. Yeah, Chris, any thoughts on like Russolino as a showdown player? Any other like ancillary showdown plays you want to mention before we move on to our second game here?
I would definitely like kickers and defenses in this
Yeah.
game. Don't go crazy, don't have all four in your lineup, but I think I'd find it hard to believe that not at least one of the four, probably even two of the four of the kicker defenses options will end up being in the optimal lineup.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. I think playing both defenses on a lot of builds is pretty sharp. I mean, when we had Justin Freeman on a little over a month ago, he sort of noted that, these defenses are going underowned across the board. And I think especially in games like this, you're going to want to target those defenses. And like the other thing is too, don't be afraid to leave a decent chunk of salary on the table. I mean, at least in this game in Seattle, DC, I don't think I'm going to be going that route for the most part. But in this game, I mean, you land on a couple defenses plus Russolino and then just play like the three highest projected players. You're probably leaving like 12 or 15,000 on the table, but that's not necessarily a bad team by any means.
Yep.
So yeah, defenses have a lot of juice. I definitely prefer Russolino to the Houston kicker just because his stats are better. He seems to be a better kicker. He actually, I mean, especially with kickers, you sort of need the range there, and they seem willing to trot him out from 50 plus, but both guys are legitimately in play. The only other guy that I wanted to mention here. Actually we should, no, that's for the Houston side. Yeah, so let's get into the Houston side here. I wrote up Brandon Silvers as a pretty decent play. I think if you assume him and Perez are both in that 10 to 15% range, my preference is Silvers, but I know that we sort of have a bit of a lean on how we think these Houston offensive tendencies will go. Chris, what are your thoughts on like Silvers versus Perez before we get into the deeper offensive discussion?
It's a tough one. I think I would lean Perez. I still think Silver's ceiling is just capped.
Yeah.
I think we've seen it once all season, whether it's because they run the ball more or whether it's McDonald gets the red zone work. He just doesn't seem to be able to get the ceiling that some of these other quarterbacks can have. And if I had to pick between the two, I'd rather take my shot on Perez because I know he'll get all the passing work and maybe he rushes a little bit as well, which Silver's just isn't going to do.
Yeah, I'm like a soft disagree there. I think I prefer Silvers, but I mean, yeah, you can pretty easily justify either guy. I mean, I think what it comes down to for me is that like I'm sort of, I guess, closer to the Vegas lines in terms of how I anticipate scoring playing out. Like I just don't, Arlington's averaged 11.5 points per game in their two games against Houston. Obviously you can make the argument they were a totally different team in week 2, in week 10. They weren't showing much, but I don't know. Part of me just feels like Houston has Arlington's number. Although for what it's worth, Arlington may have a little more juice this week than they did last week because pass rusher Tim Ward is out with a shoulder issue. He came back last week, first time in like a month. He's one of the best pass rushers in the XFL. And then ends up missing this week after getting like 20 snaps in week 10. So that's a little disappointing for Houston, but I mean, their defense is still really, really good. And yeah, it's hard to anticipate a lot of scoring from Arlington. The more interesting discussion though, I think is around Houston's broader offensive tendencies. Early in the season, first 5 or so weeks, we were talking about how, they're right there with Seattle in pass rate. They were leading the league in neutral situation pass rate. But since Brandon Silvers hurt his shoulder in week 5, since week 5, or I should say since week 7, especially, they've been really run heavy. 54% pass rate since week 7. That's the third lowest among all teams. And they're averaging a league leading 120 rushing yards per game, eclipsing 140 yards in 3 of their last 4 games. Keep in mind in their first 6 games, their pass rate was 65% and they were averaging just 79 rushing yards per game. So that's like a 40% boost in rushing production. Digging a little deeper there, they've been super aggressive running the ball in the red zone, only a 30% red zone pass rate compared to their first 6 games where that number was around 40%. Even DC season long is throwing the ball at a 43% rate in the red zone. So this is like a crazy run heavy red zone offense. And at least for showdown purposes, that kind of makes me lean a little bit more into a guy like Cole McDonald. Obviously, not in play for the 2-game slate by any means. But I do think McDonald has a little juice for showdown because, he's stealing these goal line carries. And I think, as the season has gone on, and especially now that we're into the playoffs, Houston's defense is, right there with Seattle and Arlington for the best remaining. It feels to me like they're going to play a little more conservative, especially in a game like this where, they probably have a clear talent advantage. And that would offensively lend itself towards running the ball because, in the games Houston's lost, it's really just been because Brandon Silvers is chucking interceptions left and right for the most part. So yeah, Chris, let's talk about these running backs a little bit. Obviously I already mentioned Cole McDonald. I'm curious on your thoughts on him too, but with this, the shift in offensive tendencies with Houston now being one of the most run heavy teams in the XFL, that makes me like Max Borghi and Bryson Aline quite a bit.
Yeah, we're definitely on an island here when it comes to projections across the industry. It seems like most people are projecting them closer to that 60% pass rate that we've seen for most of the season, not what they've been doing recently. So yeah, this is a spot where I'm going to definitely try to push our leverage and what we think Houston's going to do in terms of running the ball and just playing good defense. McDonald is a great showdown play. You can play him with Silvers in showdown. I think that's totally fine. But yeah, Borghi and Aline will probably be two of my more favorite plays of the week. When it comes to deciding between them, Borghi's definitely going to get more of the better looks, but he's also more expensive. I don't think I have a strong lean between the two of them of which one I like better. I probably just will depend on what the rest of my lineup looks like and what salary I can fit. They're probably going to be about the same amount percentage owned. Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a strong lean between the two of them as much as I just like attacking the rushing attack.
Yeah, I'm kind of in the same boat. I have a hard time deciding between the two. Honestly, for the 2-game slate, I do think you can play both guys.
Sure.
I think that's fine. Houston scores 3 touchdowns. There's a chance Borghi and Aline get all of them with how much they're running in the red zone. Yeah, I don't really have a lean there. I'm kind of with you. I think they'll be similarly owned. And they're both like great leverage. Like obviously Borghi is strong leverage off of Abram Smith, Aline strong leverage off of Letty Brown. So yeah, to me, they both make a lot of sense. I don't know. I think I'll just be overweight both guys. That's kind of what it comes down to for me. I should entertain though the bearish case for these guys as much as, I do like them. And I think our projections are really on point this week. There's kind of 2 ways this goes south for both rushers. Either the Houston offense just totally sucks, which is, possible. The Arlington defense is pretty good. And Silvers has not looked great since week 5. Or running back Jeremy Cox in week 10, 120 rushing yards on 20 attempts. It was one of the highest graded rushing performances by PFF of the season. Maybe he played well enough to get himself some snaps this week, or maybe Dejoun Lee is back. In which case, I'd only expect one of those guys between Cox and Lee to be active, but one of them probably will. And we've seen Dejoun Lee, Houston's running back 3, hasn't played more than 13% of snaps since week 2, so we're not worried too much about playing time. But I am moderately concerned that they could steal a goal line carry and perhaps steal a touchdown, and that would be pretty devastating for either Aline or Borghi. At the same time, though, I think that's relatively unlikely. They deemed Aline so important to the team that they played him on 2 offensive snaps last week. Like
Right.
Borghi and Aline are the dogs in this backfield, and in the playoffs, you play your dogs. So, yeah. Any final thoughts on this backfield before we get to the wide receivers here?
No, I think you covered it. Their major downside is Houston being bad, or they just eat into each other too much. But you can kind of say that for all the running backs outside of Abram Smith.
Yeah. The eating into each other is definitely a risk. The nice thing with that, though, that would hurt Borghi more than Aline if it's like a true 50-50 split. Aline's only 3,900. He's so cheap that, it's like he could get there on 7 or 8 carries. Like it won't take much. And he's super explosive. He's been one of the most efficient running backs in the XFL. One final thing I should mention on Brandon Silvers is, like I said, he's been dealing with a shoulder injury since week 5. He did get week 10 off. So I think like there's a small chance like that sort of fixed him. I'm honestly not sure. But that might be a worthwhile note. Wide receivers here looking at industry projections, we're pretty consistently underweight all these guys in terms of like our projection versus industry. I'll start with the guy that I hate the most, which is pretty obviously Cedric Byrd, as always. I do think Cedric Byrd is definitely in play for both the 2-game slate and showdown if Michael Bandy's inactive. If Bandy's active, though, I mean, Cedric Byrd might only run a route on 50% of snaps, and I don't think you could reasonably anticipate more than 3 or 4 targets for him. Bandy is like huge for Cedric Byrd. He's listed as Cedric Byrd's direct backup, and I think Bandy is just outright better than Cedric Byrd. So that's like one of the main things I'm going to be watching. Chris, who do you like out of these wide receivers? Because I feel like that's a more difficult conversation.
Yeah, that is difficult given the way that we're projecting this game to go.
Yeah.
My favorite is probably Justin Smith. He's going to be decently popular, but he's cheap enough where I just need him to catch that one home run ball and I'm happy. And I don't think I'm getting that with Byrd or Travell Harris, who also will probably be popular. Burnett has that capability to him, but he's so expensive that it just makes it hard to pull off. So yeah, Justin Smith. And then I think guys like Putnam and Salter are definitely in play for showdown.
I don't know. Like Putman and Salter, they're tough. I don't know if they get much run. Putman, I'd be moderately interested in showdown if Bandy sits. I don't think there's going to be many slot snaps for him if Bandy sits. Salter, ran 100% of the routes in week 10, but I mean, Burnett sat. I think that's Burnett's role. I don't think I'd touch Salter in showdown. Burnett for the 2-game slate, I think is pretty interesting as leverage off of some of these more expensive Seattle guys or even some of the DC wide receivers. Because he's so expensive. Like, I mean, we're underweight on him relative to the industry, even industry wide. I mean, he just doesn't project well at all. So I think you could argue for some leverage there on Burnett, but I'm kind of with you. My favorite guy out of the group is Justin Smith. He'll definitely be the most popular though, I think. And I mean, even if Michael Bandy sits, I'm probably going to be underweight Cedric Byrd, for the 2-game slate at least. I mean, still fine for showdown, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's tough with these receivers given that we're anticipating like a run heavy approach here from Houston. Another thing I should mention on the run heavy note was I had a tweet this week, which I thought was one of my more important tweets of the season. Houston's been very run heavy against Arlington historically. Obviously, you could argue, cherry pick sample given the way these last 2 games have gone. But I do think there's some signal there, especially given how they've played in the second half of the season. The Houston wide receivers are tough. I think it makes sense to sort of be pretty cautious with these guys overall. Chris, any final thoughts on these Houston pass catchers?
Now we can move to the more high scoring game.
All right. Yeah. A lot more fun wide receiver conversations to be had here. Seattle Sea Dragons at the DC Defenders. This game is a Sunday 3 p.m. kickoff. Total here is 48.5. DC favored by 3. Chris, any bets you like?
I think this line's pretty good. Maybe there's some edge on the DC side the Seattle side of things, but not enough for me, I don't think, to place a bet on it. I think it's a really good line.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in line. I mean, the total I think is like almost perfect. I'd have a slight lean to the over, but I think that's pretty correct. It's actually out to 49 in some spots. I really like the Seattle side here for what it's worth. More Seattle money line than Seattle +3, but I think both are pretty strong bets. I mean, I think Seattle is the outright better team on a neutral field. I think they'd very clearly be favored by a point or two. DC does have a legit home field advantage. They will be rocking at Audi Stadium. So, that's sort of the only wild card there. And I think that's the main reason DC is favored in this contest. But I do really like the Seattle side. I mean, DiNucci's just been playing so well lately. His main issue, early on in the season, this was turnovers. And I think last 4 weeks, only 4 turnover worthy plays as graded by PFF. So definitely some juice there. On the Seattle side, injuries, DC is clean. Seattle has a couple guys to monitor. Blake Jackson was limited on Thursday with a shoulder injury. I expect him to play. I don't think there's too much to worry about there. Damian Willis did not participate in Thursday's practice due to a shoulder injury. Damian Willis only ran he had a 10% route share last week. This is definitely of concern for fantasy players. I think he's legitimately questionable, and I probably lean towards Willis sitting. And that sort of leads us nicely into the Seattle side of things. I mean, like I said, with DiNucci, he's been playing a lot better lately. It feels like the Seattle offense is sort of coming into their own. And I mean, on the defensive side of the ball, Seattle's also been playing really well. So yeah, Chris, what are your thoughts on DiNucci this week? Because I imagine he's going to be on about half the rosters on the 2-game slate.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the McCarron DiNucci situation from last week. He's going to be, like you said, almost half the lineups. And if he puts up a good enough score, it could be enough to totally block out any team that doesn't have him. It's tough to say if I want to get half of my lineups with DiNucci because I think Teamu is interesting, but man, it's going to be a tough pill to swallow if you see DiNucci drop 30 points and all of these other QBs could realistically not cross 20 and I wouldn't be shocked.
Yeah, that's a tough thing is DiNucci's been priced down a little bit, only 11,200 for the 2-game slate. And that's, only 1,200 more than Teamu. So you don't get a huge price edge from going with Teamu, which is, I mean, a big part of the reason we think DiNucci's going to be just so popular. Yeah, I mean, he'll probably be on at least 35 or 40% of my teams, maybe more. I really like Teamu for what it's worth. We'll get to that discussion in a little bit. I guess the trickiest part with DiNucci, like the weeks of old, although pricing is a little more condensed, is that, these wide receivers for Seattle are pretty dang expensive. Ja'Cory Pearson, Josh Gordon, and Blake Jackson, all priced over 8K. Juwan Green's now 7,100, which is a pretty tough pill to swallow. I think my favorite of the group is Jordan Vesey, especially if Damian Willis sits. Willis, last week, like I said, 10% of the routes. Vesey and Gordon were both over 90%. I think Vesey was at 98%. Really good stuff there from Vesey. So I think he's my favorite. I also wrote up Josh Gordon as a guy like Chris. Who are you playing in this Seattle wide receiver group?
Yeah, I like VC a lot. DiNucci will just throw the ball up to him downfield. So I definitely think that is a good option. Gordon, I always have a hard time playing Gordon because I think he gets popular and he seems like he gets high value targets though. So probably good to mix him in as well. I like Pearson. I'm still waiting for the Blake Jackson breakout game. He's really killed me the past 2 weeks, but he's the only receiver that runs every single route. Yeah, I'll be mixing and matching all these guys. I think you want exposure to all of them. Juwan Green did see a dip in routes last week.
He was coming off an injury, so
Yeah,
I thought that could have explained it maybe.
Yeah, and if that is, back to normal, he's probably going to be the least popular one. So he becomes probably a guy that maybe you want to be a little aggressive with and hope that it was the injury or something. Because if you're playing DiNucci snacks, you're just going to be eating a ton of ownership. So you got to get creative somehow. Otherwise, you're not going to win first. So yeah, mixing in Green, maybe getting over 10-50%, I think is not a bad idea. That's pretty much all the notable receivers.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of nice with Willis likely out because it's very condensed between those 5 guys. I'm with you. I think you definitely want to mix and match. You want, exposure to pretty much everyone. I think that was a pretty sharp take on, Juwan Green potentially going under-owned. I like Blake Jackson. I mean, realistically, you can make an argument for every single one of these guys. Final thing I'll say on VC, though, and I think I've noted this before, he's 11th among playoff wide receivers in targets in the second half of the season, but he's top 5 in red zone targets, air yards, and deep targets. So the targets he's getting is really valuable. And especially now that, if Willis is out, we can pretty safely project him for a 90% route share. I mean, that's pretty juicy to me at 5,300. I also think because all these wide receivers are going to be popular, and obviously, as we said, DiNucci is going to be crazy popular. On the 2-game slate, I'm curious on your thoughts, but I think you can realistically triple stack DiNucci
Yes,
with
definitely.
3 wide receivers, and then just go some salary relief in the other spots. Like no one's going to play that. I think double stacks, especially on a 2-game slate, will be pretty common. So yeah, getting out there with a triple or two might be the move in some of the larger field stuff.
Yep, I would definitely. I think you got a minimum double stack him. Just because you're going to be half the field is going to have DiNucci. You got to be. You need him to go nuclear or at least play well for him to really pay off for you at that ownership.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, I don't know. Maybe like another route you could take is you could maybe try to single stack him with some of the less popular guys, like maybe like DiNucci, Jawan Green, and then play a decent amount of DC guys, and then hope that's a fairly unique
Yeah,
combo.
you could mix the running backs in, like Hammonds in particular. I think that's another way to do it without more traditional stacking.
Yeah, for sure. That sort of leads us nicely into this running back discussion. It is noteworthy that Brendan Knox, he was activated off IR ahead of week 10, ended up being a healthy scratch. He's back on the depth chart this week, listed as the direct backup behind Philip Lindsay. TJ Hammonds actually didn't show up listed as a running back. He showed up listed as a wide receiver, but I mean, we know he's more of a running back in the coach's eyes. To me, I mean, Hammonds obviously projects pretty decent for us right now. But this like Hammond's value and like how I'm going to play this backfield comes down a lot to just, is Brandon Knox active? Because if Knox is active, it's going to be a super gross rotation. I'll probably be mostly off Hammonds. Lindsay is totally dust if Knox is
Yeah,
active. But if Knox sits, then we're looking at the backfield we've seen these last few weeks where Charlie Temo Payao is, stealing about 30% of the snaps. And then you've got Hammonds working in. I think Hammonds would probably be the favorite to get most of the usage and would be the guy that I'd want to play. I mean, Philip Lindsay, 6,600. Industry wide, he projects pretty poorly. For us, he doesn't project very well at all. We have him projected for about 5 DraftKings points right now. The only nice thing I can say about Lindsay is that he's gotten a good chunk of the red zone work. But if Knox is back, I think that red zone work might go out the window. This feels like a really tough backfield to project, but I mean, on a 2-game slate and for showdown, it's still pretty important. Chris, I'm really curious on your thoughts here, because I'm still trying to figure this one out.
if Knox is active, probably pretty much off it. I could be talked into Hammonds if Knox is active and Willis is inactive, because maybe they need him to run some more routes than usual or something like that. If Knox is not active, definitely like Hammonds. I think as gross as Lindsay is, he's probably a good play on this slate. Like, you're not going to get many guys at sub 5% ownership that are going to get red zone looks and
Yeah,
whatnot. Like,
multiple touchdowns is absolutely in the range of
right.
outcomes if Knox sits, especially.
Right. Like actually, I don't know if there's another guy on this slate that is going to be sub 5% and gets near the amount of potential high value touches that he could get. So definitely keep that in mind. If Knox is active, I don't think I would mess with Lindsay then. But if he's inactive, I think you probably do want some exposure to him.
Yeah, and I'd imagine maybe some viewers are wondering, like, oh, should I be playing Brandon Knox? He is not in the player pool, so you can. But yeah, I do think it's a pretty nuanced discussion there. Definitely got to keep an eye on Knox's status. But I do think that's a pretty sharp take, Chris. I mean, Lindsay, like, no one's going to want to play him. He just projects terribly. Like, you look at his snap share, was it like 16% last week? I mean, just really, really bad. Only at like, I think, 20-ish percent, 25% since he joined the team. They clearly don't feel super comfortable with him right now. And I mean, he hasn't played great. I think he's averaging below 3 yards per carry. But yeah, I mean, the red zone work is absolutely there. And it's like, you can't, if you want to run the ball inside the 5-yard line and you don't have Brandon Knox, maybe the ball goes to Temo Peo, but they don't really seem very willing to give him the ball. They just want to give him snaps. You're not giving it to TJ Hammonds inside the 5, that's for sure. So unless maybe you're in 2-minute and you don't have time to sub. So yeah, Lindsay at the goal line, I think definitely has some juice. on the 2-game slate. And the same could probably be said for Showdown. He's a little more reasonably priced there at 6,000. So I probably like him a little more in Showdown, but yeah, I mean, it is tough with the Seattle backfield.
I mean, Devion Smith and Letty Brown are going to both be easily over 20%, if not Letty Brown getting to close to 40.
Yeah.
And they're projected to score. Seattle's projected to score almost a touchdown more in the implied total. So why not take a shot at Lindsey at sub 5%?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think if you're making 5+ teams, I think it makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the DC side of things, I really like Teamu this week. He's sort of this nice middle between a guy like DiNucci, who we know has, probably the safest floor, highest projection, and is going to be the most popular. And then we've got, 2 quarterbacks who are both kind of like in Perez and Silvers. Since week 7, Teamu is PFF's second highest graded quarterback, averaging 28.5 DraftKings fantasy points per game over that stretch. He's only fallen below 29.9 DraftKings points just once over his last 4 games. And that was in week 9 when De'Aaron King got 2 full drives and scored 9 DraftKings points himself. So, if you gave those points to Teamu, he'd be averaging like 32 or 33 over the last 4 weeks, which is just absolutely insane. I mean, he's looked like really good. We know, though, historically, Teamu can be a pretty streaky guy. He's my favorite quarterback play of the week, though, at least in tournaments. If he's 25% owned in like the 2-game slate, I'm probably going to be notably overweight there. Chris, what are your thoughts on Teamu? Because I really like him in this contest.
Yeah, I like him too for all the reasons you said, and the leverage you get off not playing Abram Smith, who's probably going to get near 50% like DiNucci. Because like you said, DiNucci plus Abram Smith is going to be how everybody starts their lineups. So you playing Jordan Teamu and Max Borghi or like I said, Philip Lindsay or something like that. You're already competing only against like a handful of teams then. So definitely like Teamu. I think stacking wise, you probably don't have to stack him, but given the small slate, it's probably just makes sense to do it. I mean, Lucky Jackson's not going to be popular. Chris Blair's not going to be popular. Josh Hammond's not going to be popular. I would lean Lucky Jackson just because we've seen how much they seem to value him and getting the ball just in his hands. And it's kind of how we've approached this DC passing attack. When they're chalky, you don't play them because it's a low pass volume offense. And when they're not chalky, take shots at them because they can break off big plays like we've seen.
Yeah, I'm with you there. I mean, I think all 3 of those wide receivers, Blair, Jackson, and Hammond, are pretty solid plays when paired with Teamu. I'm in agreement. You don't need to stack Teamu because of his rushing upside, but he has been throwing really well lately, so I would lean towards stacking him. I mean, you can totally get away with double stacks too, especially given the total this week. I mean, we could see just a ton of points from both these quarterbacks. Like, I mean, if these 2 quarterbacks combined for like 70 or 80 DraftKings points, I don't think anyone would be totally shocked. My favorite of the trio of wide receivers is Chris Blair. I mean, it's tight. I'd expect Blair to be the most popular. I think he has a chance to push for 20% ownership. Jackson and Hammond, though, might be like 10%. But since week 6, Chris Blair has actually led the defenders in targets, receiving yards, yards per out run, air yards, and deep targets. And if Lucky Jackson hadn't turned 5 of his 6 red zone targets into touchdowns, then Blair would also lead DC pass catchers in fantasy points per game. So, there's a pretty good argument for Chris Blair. But at the same time, I mean, we've seen, the target shares are pretty condensed across the board among all 3 of these guys. Lucky Jackson's obviously, pretty impressive talent. I really don't think you can go super wrong with any of them. I mean, if you're making multiple teams, you're probably just mixing and matching. For Showdown, though, the conversation gets a little more interesting because we can get into some of these niche guys who I don't really think are in play for the 2-game slate. The 2 guys that stood out to me who I wrote up, Ethan Wolf at tight end. It's really tough because we haven't really seen, especially in the second half of the season, someone emerge as like the lead DC tight end. It was Ethan Wolf to start the year. He got hurt, and I think he led the tight ends in route share last week. Alex Ellis and Briley Moore McKinney are all in play for Showdown, but I think Ethan Wolf is my lean. Yeah, Chris, do you have a Showdown lean for these tight ends at all?
Yeah, I think you're on the same thought process that I'd have. Ethan Wolf does seem like the favorite tight end. I mean, he's been running the most, almost half the routes the past 2 weeks. We've seen him be the lead dog earlier in the season. Yeah, that's what I would lean. I think Brandon Smith is a wide receiver you could definitely play as well on Showdown. Maybe even the 4-game slate if you don't want to play an Arlington guy. I'd probably just rather play an Arlington guy, but I think there's something there with Brandon Smith potentially.
Yeah, they like him in that wide receiver four role. 40% route share over the last 3 weeks. Well, seeing at least 2 targets in each of his last 4 games. So like he's not going to see like crazy volume relative to his price, but I mean he catches a deep ball, catches a touchdown. Like he could get there. I don't know. It's if you're making a bunch of 2-game slate teams, you can definitely get there. It does feel a little thin for the 2-game slate, but I like him a lot for Showdown.
Yep.
Yeah, and then we have the DC backfield, which is like the easiest conversation ever because it's literally one man. And that man is Abram Smith. Abram Smith in his 2 games without Raquel Armstead has averaged a 93% snap share, 78% route share, and has earned 100% of backfield weighted opportunity, 96% of snaps last week. I mean, you don't see usage like this in the NFL. I mean, much less spring football. Abram Smith without Raquel Armstead is pretty easily seeing the greatest usage in spring football history. At the same time, though, he's going to be crazy popular this week. He's like DiNucci levels of popular. He's going to be on half the teams. Yeah, Chris, how do you want to play this backfield? Or should I say, how do you want to play Abram Smith?
Yeah, this feels scary, but my initial thoughts are fade him a little bit because basically we just need him not to have the nuclear game. And we have seen very few running backs have nuclear games as a whole in the XFL. Of course, Abram Smith is the one guy that has and definitely could this week. But we talked about how we like Teamu. We talked about how we like Houston running backs. I don't really want to be building with 3 running backs or anything in my lineups. Yeah, I'll probably come a little bit under the field on Abram Smith. It's probably too scary to full fade him or anything like that, but I think that's my lean.
Yeah, I'm there with you. I mean, if I wasn't so bullish on the Houston guys, I'd probably just eat the chalk with Abram Smith. But man, I mean, I think we've got a pretty good angle here with Houston likely going run heavy, and that makes me want to lay off Abram Smith a little bit there. And yeah, I mean, Teamu is nice goal line leverage. And like the thing is, Abram Smith, while his projection industry wide is really, really strong, I mean, we've seen a pretty low floor. Last week, only 5.4 DraftKings points, despite playing on 96% of the snaps. Across the full season, Teamu and Derek King basically have as many inside the 5 and inside the 10 carries as Abram Smith does. So, and he has, 1.6 targets per game. He has no receiving role. So like the floor actually is pretty dang low on a guy like Abram Smith. And I think if he's going to be super popular, I mean, a full fade feels really tough on a 2-game slate, but I think, you could play 25% Abram Smith, which is probably about half of what the field's going to play. And I think you can feel pretty good about that. Because that floor is it is really low. I mean, obviously, no one here would be surprised if he scored 20 DraftKings points, but the floor, like you look at median projections, I think it's easy to think like, oh, the floor's 40% of his median projection. It might actually be a lot lower than that.
Yeah. We have him projected for 17 DraftKings points. And if he hits that mark, which is, the most likely outcome, you probably are in good shape if you didn't play him. Like you probably can recover that elsewhere, assuming there's receivers that go off and you nail them. Stuff like that.
I mean, it's like if Bryson Aline gets to 12,
right.
I mean, Abram Smith has to score like 30 points to beat that score. So, so I thought your note on you don't want to play 3 running backs was interesting. I was thinking about it this morning, last night. I want to say I'm a little more willing to play 3 running backs this week just because we have such limited options, but I'm still I'm not sure about that. I mean, obviously we know, like, for the most part in the XFL, these wide receivers have had much better upside. At the same time, though, I mean, there's a handful of somewhat compelling running back plays. Yeah, I don't know. How do you think you want to play like running back overall this week?
I probably am going to stay away from 3
Yeah,
in most cases. I could definitely play 2. I have no issues with playing 2.
yeah,
It's just I think between Seattle's high pass rate and all their guys, and I like one of the DC guys to do something. I think, and then I think a cheap like there's going to be a cheap Arlington guy or something
yeah.
that gets in the optimal lineup. Um, I maybe it is. So if you're playing Abram Smith, maybe that's a way to get unique with him is play 3 running backs, play him, Borgie or Aline and Hammonds or Lindsay or Letty Brown, even like something like that. You got to be just real creative with how you're playing Abram Smith and running backs as a whole.
Yeah, looking at like industry-wide values, if I get rid of QB, I mean the entire top 10 outside of Aline and Abram Smith are wide receivers and tight ends. So, Letty Brown's up there too. But yeah, I don't think 3 running back will be super popular. I mean, probably the larger in the larger tournaments, it'll probably be a little less popular. So yeah, that's I don't know. It's tough. But yeah, I think I don't know. I guess I don't really have a super strong lean on how I'm going to play running back. I'll probably mix in all the combos or as much as I can reasonably fit. The other thing I wanted to talk about a little bit before we get out of here is in the second showdown slate, the Sunday showdown. I mean, Danucci's going to be like legitimately 100% owned. Teamu will probably be like 85% owned. Do you think it's reasonable to get away from, I mean, Danucci probably not, but either quarterback? I mean, are one QB builds like in play very much? It's so hard to see either guy scoring less than 20 DraftKings points. That's my only problem.
Yeah. I'm not going off Danucci. There's
Yeah.
just so little outcomes where he's not in that lineup. I think you can do it with Teamu. In that case, you probably want Abram Smith.
Hmm.
Um, I'm trying to think if like a DC one-off makes sense, but not really. We've pretty much seen Teamu get dragged along enough when one of his receivers plays well.
Yeah.
Uh, it doesn't feel great. I think you can do it without Teamu though, but I would probably want Abram Smith in there then.
Yeah. I'm with you. I think maybe there's a slight chance Teamu plays so badly that he gets benched. That's a risk. He got beat up pretty badly last time he played Seattle. Maybe he gets hurt. You could kind of play the Derek King angle there. For what it's worth, I really don't like King this week nearly as much as I like Cole McDonald for showdown purposes. It feels like King's role has really faded in the second half of the season. Outside of week 9, he's only averaging 8 snaps per game. He's live for a goal line touch or whatever, but he's priced up. He's 8K. So yeah, I think, if you are getting rid of Teamu, it makes more sense to sort of play into the Abram Smith angle. Maybe you play like Abram Smith captain with just a ton of Seattle guys, and you hope you get the Abram Smith, like, what was that, like the week 5 game against
Yep.
St. Louis or whatever it was.
Yeah, that's viable for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Chris, any final thoughts before we get out of here?
Nope, just try to get different in your line. It's going to be tough this week. Don't be afraid to play one. I mean, we saw Andrew Jamil, Stephen Mitchell last week be optimal plays, and this week there's even less options, and we think we know as much as we do, and it's often not that much. So yeah, just try to get different somehow.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think the final thing that I wanted to go over for a minute or two was on the 2-game slate. And this is something I've always struggled with a little bit, is how do we handle defenses versus opposing players, and like defenses overall? I mean, I think it's probably safe to say that Arlington and Houston, those defenses will soak up
Most of it.
80% of
Yeah.
ownership. Like, they're going to be super popular. So that makes me wonder. I mean, Seattle and DC, we're not anticipating like a great defensive performance from either unit. We're anticipating a lot of points in that game. At the same time, though, I mean, a defensive touchdown on a 2-game slate is really all it takes, and those are like completely random. So yeah, if I do go with like the Seattle defense or the DC defense, am I comfortable with multiple players facing them? I I kind of lean yes, at the very least for the uniqueness. Not something I want to do a ton of. I mean, obviously, for the most part, you want to maximize your correlations. But yeah, Chris, I'm curious on your thoughts there.
The only thing I'll really avoid is probably playing it against the opposing QB.
Mhm.
I think DC's super viable because Danucci's thrown picks before. Maybe he does that again. They drop it. You generally want to play your defenses against teams that drop back more because it leads to sacks and interceptions.
Yeah.
So yeah, I could play DC versus Seattle, but not play Danucci, but still play two Seattle receivers, honestly, even and feel okay with that. Um, Definitely one is fine. Seattle's a little trickier because DC is so run heavy, so it's harder for them to be the optimal defense and DC have, a good offensive output
Yeah.
because they're running so much, they're going to have to score touchdowns to pay off. But you could definitely do it with a DC receiver. I don't know if I would do it versus like Abram Smith though, for example.
Yeah. So I don't know. Maybe this is a little too galaxy brain, but I do think DC defense versus Danucci on the 2-game slate is a little live. Just because like he has absolutely no benching risk. And I mean, he could throw a pick six, even two, and still drop like 30
True. That's
DraftKings
true.
points.
Yeah.
Right. So, and I don't really think you could say that about any other quarterback on the slate. So I don't know. I mean, maybe Teamu's in that discussion, but I definitely prefer. Yeah, I think the points you made on the DC defense make a ton of sense. Yeah, because Seattle drops back so much, and I mean DC's super aggressive. So to me, it kind of feels like they're either going to get totally smoked, or they actually might be able to come up with a handful of turnovers and maybe a touchdown. So yeah, I think
Yeah.
those angles make sense.
Yeah, I like that call you had actually with Danucci because he's not going to get benched and
No.
minus 2 points if he throws two picks. And if one of those goes for a touchdown, he's got to pass even more. So
Yeah.
great.
Yeah, I mean, DraftKings scoring is very forgiving for to quarterbacks on turnovers. So yeah, and I don't know. Maybe pick sixes are better for his expectation because it puts Seattle in a hole, right? So then they have to throw even more.
Yeah.
But guys, we have talked for an hour about 2 XFL games. I mean, come on, is this not like the greatest show in the world? Thank you so much for sticking with us throughout the season. It's been a ton of fun. We will be back for the championship game, which actually isn't next weekend. Teams get a 2-week break. So the championship game, I believe, is either May 12th or May 13th. We haven't set a date and time for that final show, but it looks like we will have a special guest. So definitely look forward to our championship game preview out in a couple weeks here. And yeah, hope to see everyone at the top of the leaderboards. Thank you so much for joining the playoff edition of the Fantasy Points XFL Breakdown.